The Good Morning America studio carried its usual early morning polish, the kind of controlled brightness designed to feel welcoming without revealing the machinery behind it. Lights hovered just out of frame, warming the set with a golden glow that suggested optimism and calm. Producers moved silently in the background, headsets snug, eyes darting between monitors. Everything was on schedule, everything was safe. That was the illusion, at least. Clint Eastwood sat opposite George Stephanopoulos with his hands folded loosely in his lap, posture relaxed but unmistakably grounded. He wore a simple dark jacket, no flourish, no attempt to impress. He looked like a man who had already outlived several versions of himself and didn't feel the need to explain any of them. The audience applauded as the camera settled, and Clint acknowledged it with a small nod, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. George began as expected, his voice warm, measured, practiced. He spoke about Clint's extraordinary career, the decades of iconic performances, the transition from actor to director, the way his films had shaped American cinema. Clint responded with brief, thoughtful answers. He talked about learning by watching others work, about patience, about letting silence do some of the storytelling. He spoke slowly, choosing words carefully, not because he was cautious, but because he didn't see any reason to rush. The exchange felt comfortable, almost reverent. George asked about Clint's latest project, about working with younger actors, about what still motivated him after so many years. Clint said he liked building things that lasted longer than a news cycle. He said he was interested in stories that respected the audience's intelligence. The crowd murmured approval, a few people nodding along. Then George shifted in his chair, subtly, but enough to register. His tone changed just slightly, not confrontational, but more pointed. He referenced how the culture had changed, how conversations around art, language, and responsibility had evolved. He framed the question carefully, asking whether Clint ever felt misunderstood or out of step with the current moment. Clint didn't answer right away. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing just a fraction, as if he were listening past the words to the intention behind them. When he spoke, his voice was calm, even conversational. He said he'd never aimed to be in step with anything except his own sense of right and wrong. He said trends came and went, but principles either held up or they didn't. George nodded, but pressed further. He brought up criticisms Clint had faced in the past, comments that had resurfaced online, debates about whether certain perspectives still belonged in mainstream spaces. He emphasized that these were conversations happening now, not accusations, just questions people were asking. The air in the studio changed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Clint straightened slightly, his hands still calm, his expression composed but more alert. He said context mattered, and that pulling words from one era and judging them by another was an easy way to avoid nuance. He said he didn't believe history was meant to be constantly rewritten to soothe present discomfort. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. George leaned forward, sensing momentum. He talked about influence, about how public figures shaped attitudes whether they intended to or not. He asked whether Clint felt any responsibility to adapt, to clarify, to reframe. Clint's eyes stayed locked on George now, steady and unblinking. He said responsibility also meant not allowing conversations to be reduced to soundbites. He said he'd spent his life working with people of every background imaginable. Long before it was fashionable to advertise it. He added that doing the work quietly often mattered more than talking about it loudly. George attempted to soften the moment, suggesting that dialogue itself was valuable, that asking hard questions was part of progress. Clint acknowledged that with a small nod, then said hard questions were only useful if they were asked honestly. He pointed out that there was a difference between curiosity and framing someone as a problem to be solved. The studio was completely silent now. Even the hum of equipment seemed distant. Clint continued, still calm, still measured. He said he didn't mind disagreement, but he did mind assumptions disguised as concern. He said he'd never asked to be anyone's moral compass, and he wasn't interested in auditioning for approval at this stage of his life. George tried to interject, but Clint finished his thought without raising his voice. He said he respected journalism, but respect went both ways. He said conversations worked best when neither side arrived with a verdict already written. The camera lingered on Clint's face for a moment longer than usual. He looked composed, unshaken, as if the shift in tone had been anticipated rather than provoked. The audience, unsure whether to applaud, remained quiet, absorbing the moment. George Stephanopoulos held his composure, but the pause before he spoke again betrayed a recalculation. Years of live television had trained him to recover smoothly, yet this moment required something more delicate than a transition. He acknowledged Clint's point with a careful nod, then said journalism wasn't about passing verdicts but about accountability, about reflecting conversations happening beyond the studio walls. His voice was even, but the phrasing carried an edge, as if drawing a line around his role. Clint listened without interruption. He didn't lean forward or gesture. He simply watched George, eyes steady, expression unreadable. When George finished, Clint took a breath that felt intentional, as though he were grounding the room before speaking again. He said accountability mattered, but it meant different things depending on where you stood. He said some people built accountability through action, through decades of work and consequences lived in real time, not through commentary or hindsight. The audience stirred, a few murmurs breaking the silence. Clint continued, explaining that he had always believed in standing by the choices he made, whether they were praised or criticized. He said he'd been wrong before, everyone had, but he'd learned that growth didn't always look like public confession or constant clarification. Sometimes growth was quiet, private, and boring, and that didn't make it any less real. George responded quickly, noting that public figures didn't have the luxury of private growth when their words shaped public discourse. He framed it as a reality of modern visibility rather than a personal critique. Clint nodded once, acknowledging the point, then said visibility was often mistaken for influence. He said real influence showed up when cameras weren't around, when decisions had consequences that couldn't be edited or spun. He paused, letting that land, then added that he found it strange how quickly conversations about art and history turned into moral audits. He said movies were reflections of their time, not instruction manuals, and that expecting them to be retroactively perfect was a misunderstanding of why stories existed in the first place. He spoke plainly, without flourish, and the simplicity made the words feel heavier. George attempted to redirect, suggesting that revisiting the past was part of learning from it. Clint agreed, but added that learning required humility on both sides. He said there was a difference between examining history and weaponizing it, between understanding and erasing. His tone never rose, but the conviction behind it was unmistakable. A producer's voice crackled faintly through an earpiece somewhere off camera, urging them toward a wrap. George glanced briefly at the clock, then back to Clint, aware that whatever came next would likely define the segment. He thanked Clint for his honesty and suggested they pivot back to film, to the craft that had brought him there in the first place. Clint smiled slightly for the first time since the shift, but it wasn't a retreat. He said he was happy to talk about film, but he wanted to finish one thought. George hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Clint said conversations like this mattered, but only if they weren't treated like contests. He said he didn't come on the show to win or lose anything, and he wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. He said he believed most people wanted the same things, fairness, dignity, a chance to be understood, but the way discussions were framed often pulled them apart instead of bringing them closer. The studio audience began to applaud, hesitant at first, then more confidently. George let it happen, his expression neutral, absorbing the room. When the applause faded, Clint leaned back slightly and added, almost conversationally, that he'd learned over time that silence could be more powerful than outrage, and restraint more effective than dominance. He said he trusted viewers to make up their own minds without being told what to think. George thanked him again, this time more sincerely, and shifted into a safer question about Clint's directing process. Clint answered briefly, but the earlier exchange hovered in the air, impossible to ignore. The energy had changed in a way that couldn't be undone by lighter topics. As the segment wrapped, the camera pulled back, the familiar music swelling. Clint stood when prompted, shook George's hand firmly but politely, and turned to acknowledge the audience. The applause this time was full, unambiguous. Clint nodded once more and exited the set with the same calm he'd brought onto it. Behind the scenes, producers exchanged glances. They knew what had just happened would live far beyond the morning broadcast. In the control room, clips were already being marked, timestamps noted. On the studio floor, George adjusted his jacket, professional as ever, but quieter than usual. Within minutes, social media lit up. Some praised Clint's composure, others debated his points, still others criticized the exchange altogether. Commentators argued over who had won, dissecting tone and phrasing as if it were a boxing match. But the moment resisted that framing. What lingered wasn't a sharp insult or dramatic walk-off. It was the stillness, the refusal to escalate, The way Clint Eastwood had answered pressure not with aggression, but with clarity, leaving no obvious opening to push back against.